The northern lights danced across the Alaskan sky, their ethereal ribbons casting strange shadows through the windows of Dr. James Harrison's research cabin. He sat at his desk, surrounded by genetic sequence readouts and tissue samples, barely noticing the spectacular display outside. 3 years of self-imposed exile had dulled his appreciation for such natural wonders. The quiet of his evening was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the wilderness, a high-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. James rushed to the window, his coffee forgotten. Through the aurora's glow, he watched an object descend from the sky, its metallic surface reflecting the celestial light show above. The ship, and there was no mistaking it for anything else, touched down in the clearing before his cabin with impossible grace. Steam rose where its hull met the snow, creating an otherworldly mist. James stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs, as a hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss. The figure that emerged was unmistakably female, but just as unmistakably alien. Her skin shimmered like polished opal, catching and reflecting the aurora's colors. When she turned to face him, her eyes were pools of liquid silver that seemed to pierce straight through him. "Dr. James Harrison," she called out, her voice carrying a musical quality that made the hair on his arm stand up. "I am Thera of Nixus, and I've crossed 17,000 light-years to find you." James swallowed hard, his scientific mind already cataloging details: bipedal humanoid structure, apparent bioluminescent properties, evidence of advanced technology. "How do you know my name?" "We've been watching Earth for some time," Thera replied, taking a careful step forward. "Your work on extreme environmental adaptation in human cells, it could save my people." The mention of his research cut through James's wonder. That work was classified and discontinued. The pain in his voice was evident, even to alien ears. "Because you lost someone." Thera's words were gentle but direct. "Your wife, Dr. Rebecca Harrison. The accident in the lab." James felt his legs go weak. He grabbed the doorframe for support, memories of fire and screaming threatening to overwhelm him. "Get out of my head." "I'm not in your head, Dr. Harrison. We studied your history, your work, your loss. We had to understand who we were asking for help." Thera's voice cracked with emotion. "My people are dying. A plague turns our bodies to crystal, spreading through our population like wildfire. 2 billion of us, becoming living statues." Despite his instinct to retreat, James found himself drawn into the conversation. "Why me?" "There are better scientists, bigger facilities." "Because you understand adaptation at its most fundamental level. Because you've seen what happens when we push too far, too fast. And because..." Thera hesitated, then continued, "Because like me, you know what it means to watch helplessly as death claims those you love." The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain. James studied Thera more carefully now, noting the subtle signs of exhaustion in her stance, the desperate hope in those alien eyes. "Show me," he said finally. Thera produced a crystal from her suit. It projected a hologram into the space between them, images of her world. James watched in horror as the recording showed Nixian children playing, then freezing mid-laugh as crystalline patterns spread across their skin. He saw hospitals full of statue-like figures, their faces locked in expressions of fear or acceptance. "The crystallization process follows genetic lines," Thera explained. "Some families are hit harder than others. Mine." She touched her neck, where faint traces of crystalline patterns were visible. "I don't have much time left." James felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died with Rebecca. The drive to solve the impossible, to push the boundaries of science not for glory but for the sake of saving lives. "Your ship," he said, already making mental calculations. "How long would it take to reach your world? With our quantum fold drive?" 3 weeks. Thera's silver eyes brightened. "Does this mean..." "I'll need equipment. Data. Full access to your medical records and research facilities. James was already moving, pulling supplies from shelves. And I want to know everything about this plague, how it started, how it spreads, what treatments you've tried. You'll have it all, Thera promised. But Dr. Harrison. James, you should know. The journey itself carries risks. Our atmosphere, our gravity, everything will be alien to you. And if you're exposed to the plague. James paused in his packing, looking at the photo of Rebecca on his desk. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to encourage him. Sometimes, he said softly, the biggest risks lead to the most important discoveries. As they boarded Thera's ship, the aurora borealis painting the sky in sheets of green and purple, James felt a familiar excitement building in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he was doing more than existing, he was living again. The ship rose silently into the night, carrying with it the hopes of a dying civilization and one human's chance at redemption. Neither James nor Thera could know that their journey would uncover secrets that would shake both their worlds to their foundations. The quantum-fold ship hummed softly as it carved its path through space, its sleek hull reflecting distant starlight. Inside the vessel's medical bay, James Harrison studied holographic displays of Nixian cellular structures, his eyes burning from hours of concentrated work. The differences between human and Nixian biology were both fascinating and daunting. Their cells contained structures he'd never seen before, wrapped in membranes that seemed to defy the laws of physics as he understood them. You should rest, Thera's melodic voice broke through his concentration. She stood in the doorway, her opalescent skin dimmed to a soft glow in the ship's night cycle. We still have 12 days before reaching Nixus. James rubbed his eyes, but didn't look away from the displays. The crystallization pattern in your genetic code, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's almost as if. He paused, frowning. As if it was designed. Thera moved closer, her silver eyes reflecting the holographic data. Designed? By whom? That's what I can't figure out. James stood, stretching his stiff muscles. The complexity, the precision of how it targets specific genetic sequences, it's too perfect to be natural evolution. A shudder ran through the ship, causing both of them to grab at nearby surfaces for support. The emergency lights flashed red, bathing the medical bay in an ominous glow. We're passing through a quantum storm, Thera explained, her voice tight with concern. The fold drive makes them unpredictable. We should get to the bridge. They made their way through the corridors as the ship bucked and swayed. James marveled at how Thera moved with fluid grace despite the turbulence, while he stumbled like a drunk sailor. When they reached the bridge, the view through the main screen took his breath away. Space itself seemed to be tearing apart before them, ribbons of energy in impossible colors weaving through the void. The ship's AI was projecting multiple course corrections, trying to navigate through the chaos. Beautiful and terrifying, James murmured, watching the cosmic dance of destruction. Like many things in this universe, Thera replied softly, her hands dancing over the control panels. Including hope. As if to punctuate her words, a massive surge of energy struck the ship. Alarms blared as systems began to fail. James watched in horror as crystalline patterns suddenly appeared on Thera's neck, spreading rapidly across her skin. The stress, she gasped, fighting to maintain control of the ship. It accelerates the process. Without thinking, James rushed to the medical kit he'd brought from the bay. I've been working on a temporary suppressant, he said, pulling out a hypo-injector. It's not tested, but dash. Do it, Thera commanded, her voice strained as the crystal began creeping up her jaw. James pressed the injector against her neck, praying he'd calculated the dosage correctly for Nixian physiology. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the crystallization began to recede. Thera let out a shuddering breath as her fingers flew over the controls with renewed strength. The ship responded, threading its way through the quantum storm like a needle through fabric. When they finally emerged into normal space, both of them slumped in relief. "That suppressant," Thera said, touching her neck where the crystal had nearly claimed her. "How did you develop it so quickly?" "I modified one of my old formulas, from when I was working on human cellular adaptation." James couldn't meet her eyes. "It's what Rebecca and I were testing when." Understanding dawned in Thera's silver gaze. "When the accident happened." James nodded, the memories washing over him. The compound was supposed to help humans survive extreme environments. Instead, it caused rapid cellular breakdown. Rebecca was exposed trying to save our research assistant. His voice cracked. "I couldn't save her." Thera's hand found his, her touch surprisingly warm. "But you just saved me. And maybe you've given us a key to fighting this plague." Before James could respond, the ship's sensors began chiming. On the main screen, a planet appeared, a world of purple oceans and crystalline continents that sparkled like diamonds under its twin suns. "Nixus," Thera breathed, her voice filled with love and sorrow. "My home." As they began their descent, James saw evidence of the plague's impact. Entire cities gleamed with an unnatural crystalline sheen, their buildings and streets littered with statue-like figures frozen in their final moments. "The quarantine zones are worse," Thera explained, guiding the ship toward a massive structure that rose from the crystalline landscape like a twisted spire. "That's the Central Research Facility. The last bastion of hope for my people." The facility's landing bay opened to receive them, its interior bustling with Nixians in protective suits. As they touched down, James noticed something odd about the facility's design. "These aren't just research labs," he said, his scientific mind putting the pieces together. "This is a fortress." Thera's expression darkened. "Yes. Because not everyone agrees with bringing outsiders to help. Some believe the plague is a divine punishment, that seeking a cure is blasphemy." She turned to face him fully. "Are you ready for this, James? Once we step off this ship, there's no turning back." James thought of Rebecca, of her unwavering dedication to helping others no matter the cost. He thought of Thera's courage in crossing the galaxy to find him, and of the billions of lives hanging in the balance. "I've been running from my past for 3 years," he said, gathering his equipment. "It's time to face the future." Together, they stepped out into the alien facility, unaware that they were being watched by eyes that gleamed with something far darker than hope. The Central Research Facility's main laboratory hummed with activity as James peered through an advanced microscope, studying the interaction between his suppressant formula and Nixian tissue samples. 2 weeks had passed since their arrival, and each day brought new discoveries, and new questions. "The cellular response is remarkable," said Professor Zena, her crystalline-flecked skin catching the light as she moved closer to examine the results. The elderly Nixian scientist had become one of their strongest allies, her centuries of experience proving invaluable. "But something still troubles you, Dr. Harrison?" James sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. "These plague markers, they're too precise, too deliberate. And look at this." He adjusted the display, highlighting a specific sequence. "There's a signature here, almost like a maker's mark." Thera, who had been reviewing data nearby, joined them at the workstation. "A maker's mark? You mean like an artist signing their work?" "More like a programmer signing their code," James replied. "This plague isn't just engineered, it's branded. Someone wanted their work to be recognized." A heavy silence fell over the laboratory. It was Zena who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The architects. Professor?" Thera's silver eyes widened with recognition of the name. The older Nixian glanced around nervously before continuing. "There are restricted archives, records from before the Great Sleep. They speak of beings called the architects who visited our world millennia ago. They offered to help us evolve, to transcend our physical forms. And your people refused? James guessed. Our ancestors chose to remain as they were. The architects left, but there were rumors. Zena's voice trailed off as the facility's lights suddenly dimmed, emergency power engaging with a low hum. Security alarms began blaring throughout the complex. Through the laboratory's windows, James could see figures moving in the shadows of the lower levels, figures that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. The Shadowborn, Thera breathed, reaching for the weapon at her hip. They've breached the outer defenses. We need to get to the secure archives, Zena said urgently. Now. Before they destroy the evidence. They rushed through darkened corridors, the sound of fighting echoing from other parts of the facility. James's heart pounded as they descended into the lower levels, memories of his wife's last moments threatening to overwhelm him. He felt Thera's hand squeeze his briefly, anchoring him to the present. The archive chamber was vast, its walls lined with crystalline data storage units that pulsed with soft light. Zena moved quickly to a hidden panel, her aged hands trembling as she input a complex sequence. The truth has been buried for generations, she explained as a hidden compartment opened. The architects didn't just leave, they promised to return. To finish what they started. James examined the ancient data crystals Zena retrieved, their surfaces etched with complex patterns. The plague is their way of forcing evolution? Turning your people into living crystal? An explosion rocked the chamber before Zena could respond. Through the smoke, dark figures emerged, Nixians whose bodies were a grotesque fusion of crystal and shadow. Their eyes glowed with an inner fire as they raised strange weapons. The ascension cannot be stopped, one of them growled, its voice resonating like breaking glass. The architect's vision will be fulfilled. Run! Thera shoved James toward a side passage as energy bolts sizzled past them. He clutched the data crystals to his chest as they fled, Zena leading them through a maze of ancient corridors. They emerged in a chamber that took James's breath away, a vast circular room whose walls were covered in holographic displays showing the history of Nixis. But it was the center of the room that drew his attention, a massive crystalline structure that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The first seed, Zena said reverently. The original crystal the architects left behind. We thought it dormant, but... She touched her own crystallized skin. It was waiting. Growing. Spreading its influence through our genetic code generation by generation. James approached the crystal, his scientific mind racing. It's not just a plague carrier, it's a transmitter. A beacon. Horror dawned in his eyes. You're not just being transformed. You're being prepared. For what? Thera demanded. The chamber shook as more explosions rocked the facility. Through the chaos, James could hear the Shadowborn getting closer. For harvesting, he realized. The architects aren't coming to save you, they're coming to collect their crop. Billions of crystalline beings, perfectly transformed according to their specifications. Thera's face hardened with determination. Then we destroy the seed. End the transmission. It's not that simple, Zena warned. The process has already taken root in our people. Destroying the seed now could kill everyone affected by the plague. James studied the ancient crystal, noting how its pulses seemed to synchronize with the crystalline patterns on Thera's skin. His mind raced back to his work with Rebecca, to the principles of cellular adaptation they discovered together. Maybe we don't need to destroy it, he said slowly. Maybe we need to reprogram it. Change the signal. He turned to Thera, his eyes alight with possibility. Your body accepted my suppressant formula. What if we could use that as a template? Create a new pattern, one that works with your biology instead of trying to transform it? The doors to the chamber burst inward as the Shadowborn finally broke through. As Thera and Zena moved to defend their position, James knew they were out of time. The next few moments would determine the fate of an entire civilization, and he had exactly one chance to get it right. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed the first seed's pulse beginning to change, its light taking on a new rhythm that echoed the beat of a human heart. Energy bolts crackled through the ancient chamber as James worked frantically at the base of the first seed, his hands flying over the crystalline controls. Each moment felt like an eternity as Thera and Xena held off the advancing Shadowborn, their weapons casting eerie shadows across the historical displays that lined the walls. "Whatever you're going to do, James, do it quickly," Thera shouted, ducking behind a pillar as another blast scorched the air where she had stood. The crystalline patterns on her skin were spreading faster now, activated by the proximity to the first seed. James's mind raced as he combined Nixian technology with principles of human genetic engineering. His suppressant formula had worked on a small scale, but reprogramming the first seed to broadcast a new pattern to an entire planet? The complexity was staggering. "Professor Xena," he called out. "The original frequency, how did the architects calibrate it to Nixian DNA?" The elderly scientist fired her weapon with surprising accuracy before responding. "They used a quantum resonance matrix. The pattern is stored in the crystalline core." James's eyes widened as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. He pulled out a small vial of his own blood, drawn earlier for testing. "Human DNA, it's more adaptable than Nixian. More resistant to forced evolution. If I can introduce it into the matrix." A massive explosion rocked the chamber. Through the smoke, a towering figure emerged, a Shadowborn leader, his body more crystal than flesh, crackling with dark energy. "Your interference ends now," the creature's voice resonated like breaking glass. "The architect's return is at hand. The harvest must proceed." Thera moved to stand between the leader and James, her weapon raised. "Our people won't be your crops," she snarled. Despite her fierce stance, James could see the crystal spreading across her face, threatening to consume her. "You still don't understand," the leader laughed, the sound like grinding stones. "This was always your destiny. The architects saw your potential millennia ago, a species perfectly suited to crystalline transformation. Through us, they will uplift you from your primitive forms. By turning us into living statues?" Thera's voice cracked with emotion. "By stealing our free will? Free will is a weakness. The crystal brings perfection. Unity. Purpose." The leader raised his hand, energy crackling between his fingers. "And those who resist must be purged." The blast that followed would have killed Thera instantly, but Xena threw herself into its path. The elderly scientist's body crystallized completely in a matter of seconds, her face frozen in an expression of determined sacrifice. "No!" Thera's cry of anguish echoed through the chamber. She unleashed a barrage of shots at the leader, but they seemed to have little effect on his crystalline form. James knew they were out of time. The first seed's pulse was accelerating, its light growing brighter. Soon it would reach a frequency that would trigger mass crystallization across the planet. He looked at the vial of blood in his hand, then at the crystal's core. "Thera," he called out. "The suppressant formula, it wasn't just stopping the transformation. It was teaching your cells to adapt on their own terms." Understanding dawned in her silver eyes. A partnership instead of a forced evolution. Exactly. Human DNA can show your cells how to work with the crystal instead of being consumed by it. But he hesitated. The sample needs to be living to take hold. And it needs to be introduced directly into the core. The implications hit Thera like a physical blow. "James, no. There has to be another way." The Shadowborn leader laughed again. "Your pathetic attempts to alter the grand design are futile. The architect's vision cannot be corrupted." James met Thera's gaze, seeing in her eyes the same dedication to saving others that he'd once seen in Rebecca's. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the biggest risks lead to the most important discoveries." Before anyone could stop him, James smashed the crystalline panel protecting the core. Alarms blared as the chamber's security systems detected the breach. The Shadowborn leader roared in rage, unleashing a blast of energy that James barely dodged. "The core's quantum field will tear you apart." Thera screamed, fighting to reach him through the chaos. James smiled sadly. "Maybe. Or maybe it'll do exactly what we need it to do." He looked at the advancing Shadowborn leader. "You want to see an evolution? Watch this." With those words, he plunged his hand directly into the first seed's core. Pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced ripped through his body as human DNA met ancient alien technology. The crystal began to spread up his arm, but this was different from the plague. This was emerging, a synthesis of human adaptability and Nixian crystalline energy. The last thing James saw before consciousness faded was Thera's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as the crystal patterns on her skin began to pulse with a new, harmonious rhythm. Then everything went white, and he knew no more. But this was not the end. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. Light pulsed through the crystalline networks of Nixus, spreading from the first seed in waves of transformative energy. In cities, villages, and quarantine zones across the planet, the deadly crystallization that had been claiming lives began to change. Instead of consuming flesh, it merged with it, creating something entirely new. In the ancient chamber, Thera watched in awe as James's unconscious form floated within the first seed's core, his body neither fully human nor fully crystalline. The Shadowborn leader had fallen to his knees, his dark crystal form cracking and reforming as the new pattern took hold. "Impossible," the leader whispered, staring at his hands as they transformed from black crystal to an opalescent sheen similar to natural Nixian skin. "The architect's design, you've changed it." "No," Thera corrected, moving closer to the first seed. "We've fulfilled it. True evolution isn't about forcing change, it's about adaptation. Partnership. Growth." She pressed her hand against the crystal surface, feeling the resonance of James's sacrifice pulsing through her own transforming body. Through the facility's communication systems, reports began flooding in from across the planet. The plague was changing, merging with its hosts instead of consuming them. Those who had been fully crystallized were slowly returning to consciousness, their forms now a perfect blend of organic and crystalline structures. Professor Zena's crystalline form began to shift as well, color and movement returning to her features. She gasped as she regained consciousness, her eyes wide with wonder. "The harmony," she breathed. "This is what the architects truly intended, not domination, but synthesis." Days passed as the transformation spread across Nixus. The Shadowborn, their forced evolution reversed, reunited with their people. The ancient divide between those who embraced change and those who feared it began to heal as they discovered their new potential together. But James remained suspended in the first seed's core, his sacrifice seemingly complete. Thera refused to leave the chamber, studying the readings and hoping for any sign of consciousness. Her own body had completed its transformation, becoming something both familiar and wonderfully new, a bridge between what was and what could be. On the seventh day, as Nixus's twin suns aligned in their monthly conjunction, the first seed's pulse changed. James's eyes snapped open, glowing with an inner light that matched the crystal's resonance. The core's surface became permeable, allowing Thera to help him emerge. He stumbled as his feet touched the ground, his body now a magnificent fusion of human and crystalline elements. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight harmonic quality that hadn't been there before. Thera's answer was to embrace him, her joy radiating through their now shared crystalline connection. Through this touch, James could feel the success of their endeavor, millions of minds linked in a network of shared consciousness while maintaining their individual identities. "The architects," James said, sorting through the knowledge flowing through the crystalline network, "they weren't trying to harvest us. They were preparing us for this moment. For the next step in both our species' evolution." As if in response to his words, a signal beamed out from the first seed, carrying news of their transformation to the distant stars. The architects would come now, not as harvesters, but as witnesses to what their experiment had ultimately achieved. In the months that followed, Nixus was transformed. The crystalline cities became living things, responding to the needs of their inhabitants. The shared consciousness of the population led to unprecedented advances in science, art, and understanding. And at the heart of it all was the partnership between two species, proving that the greatest achievements come not from conquest or forced change, but from cooperation and mutual growth. James established a new research center, dedicated to studying the implications of their transformation for both Earth and Nixus. The facility became a beacon for those seeking to understand the potential of human-Nixian cooperation. One evening, as they stood watching the twin suns set from the facility's highest tower, Thera found James lost in thought. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking that risk?" James looked at his crystalline hand, thinking of Rebecca and the sacrifice she had made in the name of scientific progress. "She would have understood," he said quietly. "Sometimes our greatest losses lead us to our greatest discoveries. And sometimes..." He turned to Thera, his transformed eyes meeting her silver ones, "They lead us exactly where we need to be." Above them, the stars beckoned with new possibility. The signal they had sent continued its journey outward, carrying a message not just to the architects, but to all civilizations. Evolution's greatest power lies not in the strength of one species, but in the willingness of many to grow together. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space, ancient beings received their message and smiled, knowing that their longest experiment had finally yielded its intended result, not the domination of one form of life over another, but the beautiful, harmonious fusion of different worlds into something greater than the sum of their parts.